Everyone. Um, so here we are, and this is our lecture for 319, and today we are talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, uh, moving on from Kant and moving beyond the three main ethical theories that we've looked at. So we've covered now virtue ethics with Aristotle, utilitarianism with John Stuart Mill, and deontology with Kant. And I am aware that there are some loose ends with Kant to wrap up, which we will be discussing throughout the rest of the semester. I think that we'll come back to these. And today we are starting with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not someone who provides a ethical theory per se, a theory about what is good or what is excellent behavior or how to be happy per se. Nietzsche is maybe more of a meta-ethicist, meaning that he's interested in the ethics of ethics. He's interested in the foundation of ethics, and more broadly, Nietzsche is interested in thinking about philosophy outside the bounds of metaphysics. Plug in here. So we have, for the most part, been dealing with theories of ethics that are grounded in traditional metaphysics. In Platonic metaphysics, Aristotelian metaphysics, we saw the basics of those in our discussion of Plato and Aristotle. And Nietzsche is the philosopher who, more than any other philosopher, tries to get out from under those foundations, to go deeper into those foundations. And through that effort is the philosopher who positions himself to kind of blow up traditional philosophy, traditional ethics, and everything that philosophy traditionally holds valuable. So Nietzsche is really the philosopher of a certain kind of destruction. He famously wrote that philosophy should be done with a hammer. Different interpretations of that, but certainly one of them is that Nietzsche intends to break down the edifice of philosophy that has been standing since Plato and Aristotle. Nietzsche is a German philosopher. His dates are 1844 to 1900. And he is, in particular, responding to the tradition that we just looked at, which I mentioned at the beginning of our Kant lecture, which is German idealism. Above all, Nietzsche is interested in escaping from the idea of rationalism, the ideas of idealism, and in addition, escaping from, in particular, Christian morality. So, maybe this requires a trigger warning or something, but Nietzsche is also the philosopher who proclaims the death of God. most famously. That's his most famous philosophical position. God is dead. So in the next 3 lectures, we're going to be walking through Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. The genealogy of morals is about the history of morality and what he sees as the way that Western morality is formed, and through an analysis of that history, he offers a critique of that morality. But today I want to look instead, before we get started on the genealogy of morals, I want to look at a different book of his, The Gay Science. There's a link on the syllabus to a selection of aphorisms from The Gay Science. And the reason I want to start with The Gay Science is that we get a clearer picture, a sort of more concise articulation of Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics in general and his critique of traditional ethics. And we have some nice, concise passages dealing with those big ideas. The 2 big ideas that I want to look at today are the death of God and what is known as the eternal return of the same, which is a kind of alternative interpretation of reality meant to supplant traditional metaphysical interpretations of reality. So I think the best way to explain Nietzsche is just to jump into the text, but I think it's also useful to get a little sense about his style. Nietzsche does not write philosophy in the way that Aristotle or Mill or Kant write philosophy. He doesn't write treatises, and for much of his work, instead, he works with aphorisms. Aphorisms are short, little sort of sage words or insights. Often, aphorisms are intended to make some counterintuitive point or to turn some common sense logic on its head. So the aphorism works well for Nietzsche's purpose, which is to overturn metaphysics, overturn Christian theology, and overturn, in essence, the history of Western thought up till him. So when last class we were talking about Kant as a rationalist whose philosophy had an enormous influence on the modern world, and I was suggesting that in Kant's universalism we have to constantly be vigilant about thinking about how that universalism excludes certain people, and the extent to which that universalism is, despite Kant's best efforts, influenced by certain cultural values. And so Nietzsche is probably one of the most, if not the most, influential philosopher on the 20th century. He dies in 1900, but his philosophy is picked up by a large number of people and goes on to form basically one or be the foundation for one whole branch of philosophy in the 20th century. We have a divide in the 20th century between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. And analytic philosophy more or less begins with Kant, and continental philosophy more or less. You can certainly make the argument begins with Nietzsche. And so I think that through reading Nietzsche, we'll have the opportunity to level some of those critiques against Kant that we didn't fully get to articulate last time. Nietzsche's style, the aphorism, has led many people, primarily in that analytic Kantian tradition, to say that Nietzsche is not properly a philosopher, that he belongs more in the genre of literature, or even something like poetry. But Nietzsche insists that he is a philosopher, or more, is not interested in the distinction between philosophy and literature. And that's really the key point, that for Nietzsche and for many people who follow Nietzsche in the 20th century, the idea that philosophy is a science, as Kant thought it ought to be, is foolish, is silly. That in fact philosophy has more power as a kind of sub-genre of literature, in the same way that you might say Plato belongs as much to literature as to philosophy, right? I mean, writing dialogues is not your traditional philosophical style. And we could say the same of Parmenides, who wrote a poem. Sorry, we didn't talk about Parmenides in this class, a pre-Socratic philosopher. Prior to Aristotle, most or many philosophers used a different style than the treatise. They wrote poems, they wrote dialogues, they wrote aphorisms. And so Nietzsche, by returning to the aphorism, is being consistent in his project to overturn the tradition of philosophy that really begins with Plato and goes through Kant. So for Nietzsche, the accusation that he is a literary figure rather than a philosopher doesn't hold a lot of water. He would say, well, the first philosophers were also writing literature, or you could make the same argument about them anyway. What makes Nietzsche a philosopher is what he talks about, what his interests are. He's discussing philosophy, and he is proposing philosophical ideas, ideas that speak directly to the problems that philosophy has been dealing with for millennia before him. So it is my position, it's not an unusual position, that Nietzsche is a philosopher, and that his sort of literary style is an attempt to make philosophy something that it has not been since Plato, essentially. And this project of overturning metaphysics requires returning to a period of time before metaphysics had begun to take hold and be determined. So, in using the allegory, the aphorism, Nietzsche is looking for other resources besides the treatise to do philosophy. A little bit more general introduction to Nietzsche, stemming from this discussion about style and aphorism in literature, is that Nietzsche is one of the philosophers who begins a critique of scientism, of the sciences, but more specifically, the culture that takes scientific truth as a kind of replacement for religious truth or philosophical truth. So a lot of Nietzsche's work is not just about critiquing metaphysics and Christianity, but also critiquing the natural sciences. One way to read Nietzsche is as the first existentialist. And existentialism is a school of philosophy, a relatively short-lived school of philosophy, but an extremely popular one that is most closely associated with the philosopher I've named before, Jean-Paul Sartre. And Nietzsche is one of the forerunners, a kind of proto-existentialist. And to the extent that that applies to Nietzsche, it's in the fact that he is interested in probing existence as an experience rather than in trying to discern some sort of transcendental structure to reality. So in some ways, Nietzsche is going to be like John Stuart Mill. There are certainly utilitarian threads in Nietzsche's thought, but he is going to be much more radical than Mill and much more critical of the tradition than Mill. Right? Mill essentially affirms the idea of Aristotelian values. So Nietzsche marks a real turning point in philosophy and in ethics. So let me try and say a little bit about Nietzsche's ethics broadly before we look at some of these aphorisms. Nietzsche is interested in experience and in existence. And Nietzsche, above all, thinks that what is good and what is the right thing to do comes from the individual's taste, the individual's preferences. We'll talk about this a lot when we start reading the genealogy of morals. But rather than say there is a virtue which is proper to the structure of the human being, or a moral law derived from from pure reason, Nietzsche thinks that the good and the moral is that which you yourself find beautiful and good and pleasurable. It is a conception of the good that puts the good beyond any possible intellectual structure or schema. We can never, let alone achieve something like a universal morality. We also can never have a set idea of what moral criteria would be, as in utilitarianism. For Nietzsche, morality is rooted in taste, preference, and aesthetic judgment in some ways. So we'll talk more about that in detail when we talk about the genealogy, but what this means is that Nietzsche is our first truly committed moral relativist. Now, what that moral relativism really looks like in its details, we'll get into. Nietzsche doesn't per se think that every idea of the good is equal, and that whatever you want to do, you have, good Lord, you have the right to do. But he does think that opposite ideas of the good opposite ideas of virtue and clashing values can be equally valid. And so, right, the good is relative to the individual. Okay. So let's look at a couple of these aphorisms from Nietzsche. And I want to start, we're in the Gay Science, in that link that I sent you. I want to start with aphorism 276 on page 180. It's on the right-hand side of the page that's marked 182. At the very bottom, you can see it's actually page 223. It's a collection of these different aphorisms. So, Nietzsche writes, "For the new year." And as always with Nietzsche, and particularly these aphorisms, we want to read as much metaphorical value into them as we can. He's using aphorisms, he's using metaphors, he's using poetic language, and all of that indicates that he's thinking about every word very carefully, and he is imbuing a lot of meaning into these things. So for the new year, what Nietzsche, the conceit of this is, it's a New Year's resolution. But what he certainly also means is, now that we have overcome metaphysics, now that we've overturned traditional philosophy, what will the future be like? What is the new way to be? And he writes, "I still live, I still think. I still have to live, for I still have to think. Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum." And so this is him reversing one of the most famous philosophical ideas and sentences in modern philosophy, which is René Descartes' cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. And I don't want to say too much about this or go down this rabbit hole, but for Descartes, the human being is purely a thinking thing, purely a rationality. And it is Descartes who sets up the beginning of the modern tradition that leads to Kant and Kant's idea of a pure, separate reason. So what Nietzsche is doing right off the bat is saying, he's reversing this, right? Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. I am, therefore I think, therefore I am. Implying that thinking is not the foundation of reality. Thinking is not perhaps even the essence of our being. Thinking is not the highest thing that we can do. And thinking is not what organizes reality exactly. Right? I am, and therefore I think. So for Nietzsche, this reversal is a reversal of idealism. Right? My corporeal, physical being is just as essential to my thinking as my thinking is to my being. The body is important. We can't overlook the body. And this is incredibly important for Nietzsche because, again, the good will be determined by our taste. And taste, Nietzsche thinks, is something that is inextricably connected to our bodily existence and is not something that we arrive at through reason. So already we see him fighting back against the tradition, overturning these articles of faith in modern philosophy. He says, "Today everybody permits himself the expression of his wish and his dearest thought. Hence I too shall say what it is that I wish from myself today, and what was the first thought to run across my heart this year. What thought shall be for me the reason, warranty, and sweetness of my life henceforth. I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary.